Chapter 0.0, Introduction, Gateways to Art, the third edition. This is chapter 0.0, and sometimes it doesn't state that very clearly throughout the book. But if you look here, the figure number, also known as a fig number, that is telling you the imagery is 0.0.1, so that's chapter 0.0, and it's the first image. So that's how the chapters are in this particular book. For some reason, they decide not to put it here as well. But it's really good to read this introduction and I'll go over it with you, so you have a better understanding of our author's, sort of a general overview of the course and some of the meanings. This is going to be a really important chapter, though. The last few pages in here are really important in terms of context and content and formal analysis. So probably page 35 through 39, you're going to need that in a bunch of different, or I would say a fair amount of different assignments. So make sure you're really familiar with that concept, the difference between formalism and content and context. And I'll get into that probably in the last video. This will be cut up into multiple videos. So again, welcome to the course, and we're going to get through chapter 0.0. We're going to talk about a general subheading here, which is what is art, and I'm going to fast forward for a moment, and we're going to get to our next subheading. So you see this fine art, craft, and the commercial arts. So that's on page 22. So it's going to have subheadings underneath the initial heading of introduction, if that makes sense. And each chapter is broken down in a similar way. There are subheadings. So what is art is our question our author's asking us. And we know if you've already experienced a fair amount of art in your life before you've even taken this course, whether you know it or not, that it has many purposes. There's functional artwork, such as ceramic bowls or something like that. There are prints made, there's posters, there's painting, there's sculpture, and so on. So it can be made from almost anything. Late 20th, early 21st century, we're in the early 21st century, art can be made from almost anything, and that's very true. You'll see a lot of things. If you go to any local gallery or museum, you're going to see art made out of trash. You're going to see art made out of repurposed materials. You're going to see paintings perhaps made out of paint, and then sometimes they're using other things like coffee grounds and soaking them into some kind of an ink or a dye. So it's kind of a free-for-all in a way out in the world today, and that makes it sometimes easier and sometimes harder to interpret, if that makes sense. Sometimes we can connect directly to the material or the idea, but sometimes it takes a little more thinking, a little more investigation to understand the work that we're looking at. Now, one of the biggest disconnects I know students have is abstraction, and how in the 20th century, in particular late 19th century even, and we're going to look at one of those in a moment, things become abstract. Now, I'm just going to say now, and I'll repeat this elsewhere, is that one of those reasons is that in the 1800s, mid-1800s, the camera is developed. So prior to the camera being developed, if you wanted a realistic portrayal of somebody, you would paint it. It would be painted. Like a king or a queen or the president would have a portrait commission. Somebody'd sit there, and you'd want an accurate portrayal of that person, accurate portrait. So the painter needed some skills to really record accurately what that person looked like. Once the camera is invented and it becomes more widespread, 1860s it becomes widespread, 1870s, 1880s, and so on, then painters decide to sort of make a left turn, if you will, and make things more abstract. When we think of the Impressionists, when we think about that, and there are some other art movements as well, but things become just a blank field of color or a squiggle, or different things happen with abstraction, different levels of abstraction. So things go I would not say wild, but things become quite open in terms of what artists are able to do and express. So we'll get into that a little bit, but for the beginning of this analogy or this way of showing you different types of art, we're going to look at imagery that has to do with rivers and waterfalls. The first one is actually one we cannot see, so kind of disregard this image. I'll stay here for a minute. So the artist, Japanese artist Hokusai, and this is in our very first sentences of the introduction on page 20. He had a painting called Maple Leaves on a River, and what he claims is to have taken a chicken from the yard and dipped its feet in red paint or ink. Japanese artists use more ink than paint, and let it run across the canvas to look like maple leaves floating on a river. If you remember or have seen Japanese maples, they're kind of skinny. They're not fluffy like a maple from the western United States or eastern United States is a whiter leaf, and a Japanese maple is skinny, kind of like chicken feet. So if it's floating on a river, it would just kind of be this red pattern on top of the water, if that makes sense. Hard to imagine because we can't actually see this piece. It doesn't exist anymore. But there's writing about it, so that's how we know about it. So that's one water image, very, I would say, simplified or abstracted. And then our second water image here is the Journey of the Sun God Re, Egyptian, 0.0.1. And this is something that is highly stylized. If you think about Egyptian art, you already knew probably what some Egyptian art looked like. This didn't surprise you, and you probably were able to identify it as Egyptian art. One of the things that is most noticeable about the figures in Egyptian art, and this is a god here, but is that its face would be profile, its feet would be profile and arms, but its chest would be facing toward us. And we've seen comedian Steve Martin does a skit about this, and there's a video by the Bangles, but all this is quite 30 years ago, 40 years ago. But there has been a lot of popular culture commentary on Egyptian art and goofing around. But all goofing around aside, this style lasted for 3,000 years almost without interruption. There's some small differences. If you look down here, this says third intermediate period. So this is more of a recent piece because Egyptian art at this point is 5,000 and 6,000 years old. So this piece is only 3,000 years old, and I'm not getting my mouse to do what I want. So BC is before the Common Era, BCE. So we go to the year 0. So notice how these numbers go 990 to 969. We're going up to the year 0. So year 0, then after that, we're like, of course, in the year 2020. So we're in the year 2020 of the Common Era, so not before the Common Era, if that makes sense. So we have to add 2020 to this number because we're going be backward from 0. So this is a negative number, if that makes sense. Okay, so that's a lot of explanation. So let's get back to our water analogy. Our serpent here is underneath the boat, and that is Apophis, and he is the enemy. He is the enemy, and the god Re that is depicted here, the sun god, is doing battle with the serpent every night so that the sun will continue to rise. So this imagery was found in an inner coffin, and so this is an apt sort of metaphor for this person being reborn into the next life. They believe that the afterlife is as active, the Egyptians do, as active as the actual life. So he's hoping to be into the afterlife in a smooth transition, and like the god Re, rising each day and defeating the serpent Apophis. Oh yeah, and it also reflects the importance of rivers in Egypt. Of course, the Nile is the one we think of. So another image that we have is Frederick Edwin Church, Niagara. Now this is more realistic looking. So we're not too far out of the Renaissance or the Baroque here. We're only 200 years out, 300 years out. And the camera, like I said, around the 1860s, 70s is when you really see this shift. This is just before the widespread use of the camera. So he's giving us an accurate depiction of water. It's pretty realistic looking. It's translucent here. He's using atmospheric perspective in this distance. You can see that this has depth of field and it looks like a realistic place. So that's the style, but the idea and the subject here is very different from our Egyptian afterlife concept. This has to do with the romanticism of the American expansion in the West. Now, this is in New York. I know it doesn't seem very far into the West, but at this point in time, in 1857, the colonies, of course, have become the United States, and there's a lot of westward expansion. The Niagara Falls is right, like literally, the other bank over here is Canada. So this is the terminus or the end of the U.S. territory. But this is about that idea of nature, and God is in nature, and the idea that God is behind this U.S. expansion. And that was a very firmly held belief for many, many years, that the idea even in taking away native lands and so on, which we've since revised that concept, but that was a firmly held belief that that the colonies and the U.S. citizens were becoming taking lands and expanding, and that was God's will. So that's the idea here in 1857. That's our mindset. Very romantic, natural image of the falls and the idea of grandeur and God in nature. Of course. Okay, so the next image of water we have is a waterfall again. So here's our waterfall 1, waterfall 2, really different. So this is 1972. She is still living, I believe, but she came out, Louise Nevelson came out of World War II, and a lot of artists were making things out of metal, and she felt that was too much like war material, so she decided to work with wood. And her idea was to abstract a cascade and some fish swimming in the waterfall. So these sort of like curved shapes, these organic shapes that we see here, represent fish, and this is sort of an enclosed waterfall. And it's monochromatic, meaning one color. It's painted wood, it's all painted white, and that's very typical of her work, but it's very abstracted. Now, some of you guys might struggle to think, what has this got to do with water? What has this got to do with fish? But that is her sensibility, and we're in a much later period, and she's doing sort of an expressionistic, abstract expressionist, or even a little bit into conceptual art, or toward, I wouldn't call this minimalism, but she's considering a personal expression here that may not have a correlation to our visual sensibility. So it's not immediately recognizable, but it does evoke sensations of water falling. This is one that you might read more about as opposed to just take a look at the work itself on its own.